A hopelessly ill man decided to fight for life, and his cure was a miracle. All right, let's get started. I'm not a fan of sob stories. But when you're told you're about to leave, and you're still sitting there drinking tea and wondering how not to go crazy before your time, you get these thoughts in your head. Weird. And maybe a little crazy. I've been diagnosed. Let's just say it wasn't a happy one, but it wasn't fatal. At first, everything was fine. I lived like everybody else. But then one day, something went wrong. Well, you know how it happens. You don't pay attention at first, and then suddenly you start to notice that you can't climb stairs without panting. Your arms won't lift, your legs feel like cotton. Just old age? No, I was only 45 at the time. So, this is the moment. The doctor looked at me as if he already knew I was expecting him. All his expressions, his gestures, nothing to hide. Silently handed me a piece of paper with the diagnosis. I didn't even read what it said. I was sure that everything was clear. It's like in a bad movie. You go to the doctor and he says you have 2 months left. He writes the diagnosis, and you stand there like a fool, thinking, well, really. But you know, if someone had told me at that moment that it was just a scarecrow, I would have said, no, I'm definitely out of luck. That's when I made up my mind. What if I die? It's like being a statistic in some report. But what if I fight? Maybe it'll work. Or at least have something I can remember when it's over. It's funny, isn't it? I really thought I could fight it. I don't believe in miracles, but why not? Sometimes strange things happen in this world that can't be explained. I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but in that moment, I felt fear. Fear that I would no longer see the faces of those who are important to me. Fear that I would no longer hear that quiet evening noise outside my window, the smell of rain that I love so much. But the scariest part was the realization that I might not have time to do something important. Strangely, that thought was in my head all the time. Maybe fear is just a way to organize my final thoughts? So, yeah, I decided to fight it. You know, it wasn't some heroic decision. It was probably more like a tantrum. If I don't try this, someone else will decide for me. I didn't know what would happen next. I had no plans, not even a readiness for a miracle. But there was one thing. I wasn't ready to give up yet. I decided not to treat myself like everyone else, but to try something of my own. I studied all the methods, read about everything. In every book, article, or video, something caught my eye. It all seemed impossible, but at the same time I believed more and more that everything is possible if you are not afraid to move forward, even if there are doubts inside. And yes, of course I made jokes about it. I even laughed inwardly, like, what if I become the new miracle? But I really wanted to see something more than the dull, ordinary, unsurprising. So I started. It didn't work out the way I planned. That's okay. Not everything in life that you expect to happen goes according to plan. In fact, for the most part, I didn't even know what I was going to do. Just not give up. And that turned out to be a big step. I started by just deciding not to give up. You know, it wasn't a big decision like in the movies. I just got myself together. I said, yeah, I'm gonna fight, and that was it. No, nothing like that. It was kind of quiet, inside. Not that I immediately believed it would work. It's just that, after that diagnosis, it became clear to me that if I didn't take care of myself, I was going to be eaten up by inaction at the very least. Sometimes I feel like all of life is one big choice. You stand at a crossroads and think, what to choose? Move forward despite everything, or give up and be just another story? The questions are so simple, but the answers are a sea of answers. And the more you think about it, the more it seems like there's no one right answer. So here I was at a point where I just didn't know what to do, what to hope for, what to expect. Because no matter how hard you try, All your efforts may come to nothing. Or it might not. Who knows? It's like going into an empty room and turning on the light. You don't know if the light bulb will come on, but you can turn it off. And that agonizing feeling that you can't control any of your decisions until you get your final answer, that's your life. You're afraid, but you still hope. What was driving me? I don't know. Fear. Yes, fear of death, definitely. But more than that. I started thinking about what I was going to leave behind. No matter what happened, I wanted to leave something behind, something small. Everyone has a chance to make a difference. And suddenly I realized that if I wasn't fighting, who else would? Who's going to save me if not myself? Sometimes I think it's in moments like this that you start to see things for real. You don't see the miracle. You don't see the glory, the recognition, none of that. You see your weakness. And that's the worst part, really. Not death. Not disease. Weakness. The feeling that you're incapable of changing anything, and that everything you've done so far is just trying to find excuses for your powerlessness. Yes, I realized I might not survive. I realized it all the time. But here's the paradox. In spite of all that, I suddenly wondered, what if? What if, despite the impossibility, I could change my fate? What if, instead of waiting for the end, I acted, and who knows, maybe something would change? Yes, I was full of doubts. There were different voices in my head. Some said it was pointless, that there are no miracles, that I'm only human, and in this game of life, I'm definitely not going to come out a winner. But another voice inside me reminded me, you're still alive. You can still try. You can take a step in a direction no man has ever gone before. That voice was my salvation. That's when I started doing something. No high-profile steps, no epic changes. I just started looking for ways to change my life, if only one step. I forgot about all that medical talk. Everything I was being offered seemed, well, not the answer. Cold pills? Laughs. I started looking for something that actually worked, that might give me a chance. But here's the thing. You start to believe in that change. Not in miracles. Not magic. But something real. The power that's inside of you. And suddenly, after a couple weeks, I felt something change. A small, almost imperceptible change. No doctor could explain why. But I was better. It wasn't a, oh, I'm a miracle survivor moment. No. It just suddenly felt better. The pain was gone, and I started to feel my strength returning. And that's where the real doubt started. I kept wondering, what is this? Chance? Or just chance? But how do you tell one from the other when your world is completely destroyed and you're not yet ready to accept that destruction as fact? This was the moment when all my faith in miracles began to move sideways. What if I was wrong? What if everything I'm experiencing is just another accident? How do I separate true power from chance? The problem was, I didn't have an answer to any of these questions. And yet, I couldn't stop. With each step into this new world, I felt something I hadn't felt before. It was as if I wasn't the only one struggling, but there was something invisible with me, something internal that held me. I don't want to be corny, but sometimes I felt like I had just become part of something bigger. It wasn't clear to me what it was, or why it was happening this way. Was it a miracle? Or was it just me finally making the decision to fight? That's a question, too. But one thing I realized for sure, I'm alive and I have a chance. Like I said, it started with small steps. At first, it was almost imperceptible. You come home, fall on the couch, and there is a little relief. At first I thought I was just tired. You know, from the long days in the hospital, from the doctors, from all those procedures that were more like a farce than a cure. But the more time passed, the more I noticed strange things. First, I began to notice how my strength was recovering. Yes, it seems like no big deal, but you know what illness is. When you're told you don't have much time, you even start to think it's true yourself. But I started doing things I couldn't do before. I got out of bed without fatigue, without fear that I would collapse. I began to sleep, peacefully, like I used to, when I wasn't afraid that every morning would be my last. I still couldn't explain how it was happening, much less why. It was like watching a miracle happening right before your eyes, but you can't believe it. Something about it was eerie. Miracles, shall we say, don't happen in real life. Or is that just who I am? But here it is, my body starting to come back to life, back to some sort of normalcy, and I can't figure out what to do about it. I'm not going to lie, at this point I started to wonder, maybe I'm going crazy. Yeah, maybe. It's not normal, after all, when you suddenly start feeling better. Who would have thought that a sick person would be so happy about their condition that they would just walk around the apartment and think, "Is that me?" It felt like the world around me was losing its firmness, starting to shake and disappear, as if I was standing on the edge of a precipice and about to fall off, but somehow I was holding on. One of those strange moments was when the pain suddenly disappeared. It just disappeared. As if someone had pressed a button and everything stopped. But that's not how it works, is it? The doctors couldn't explain it. They kept saying the same thing. It's impossible. But for me, it became real. At first I wanted to explain it as an accident. But there are no accidents in life. At least not in the way I understood it before. I should be happy, shouldn't I? But the further I went down this path, the more doubts arose. What was it? A miracle? Or was it just my psyche setting up some kind of self-imposed mechanism to make me feel like I was still capable of making a difference? I'm alive after all, not dead. But that's where that elusive line between reality and imagination starts to lose its shape. You see, when you encounter a miracle, you don't always want to believe in it. It's like in the movies. The hero can't believe his luck because he realizes that it doesn't work that way in real life. So there I sat, alone, at night, trying to realize what was happening to me. I couldn't calm myself down. I wanted to tell myself that it was all a fluke. But when you're told you're sick and you suddenly start to feel normal, something inside you refuses to see it as a miracle. You think, I'm going crazy. This whole thing is some kind of nightmare. The brain is working too well and too actively. I tried to find an explanation, maybe even knew there wouldn't be one. But there was something terrifying about it. I was terrified that I wouldn't be able to stop it. Could I control what was happening, or was there more to it than that? Is it a miracle, or is it just my psyche playing tricks on me? The doctors continued to look at me with bewilderment. Yes, they couldn't find an explanation. But each visit made me feel more and more empty. They didn't believe in miracles. And I began to think more and more that maybe a miracle was the only explanation for what was happening. And you know, it's wild. Because miracles are always something big and bright and give you answers. And I didn't want those answers. I didn't want to believe in a miracle because it would shatter what I knew about the world. And then, as is often the case, I had to try to stifle those thoughts. I couldn't allow strong beliefs about a miracle to enter my head, because then my whole reality would collapse. And if a miracle exists, how will I perceive my life going forward? And if I am truly healed, what will that mean? It was a moment when I was trying to figure out what was better, to believe it or not to believe it. It was a struggle for control, for a reality that was beginning to feel like something foreign to me. But there was one thing that kept me going. I couldn't ignore what was happening. These oddities, these improvements, they kept happening. And no matter what I thought, no matter what I told myself, I couldn't hide the fact that something had changed. Here's the thing. When you're confronted with something that isn't really explained, and you start seeing results that can't be real, something weird starts happening inside of you. You kind of don't understand what you want. You're sure you're not ready to give up, But here are these first signs of improvement that are coming on completely undefined ground that make you wonder. What if I'm making all this up? What if it's all just a game of my mind? What if, in spite of everything, I can't fight what is really out of control? I could feel my own strength beginning to erode. It seems like things should be easier when you see success. You start fighting, and you win. But not here. It was different here. Every step was like walking through quicksand. You don't know which way to turn because none of your thoughts give you confidence. It's not just doubts about the miracle, it's doubts about whether it's even possible to win. Yes, a miracle might exist. But what if a miracle isn't what you need? What if all this struggle with yourself and the world is just an illusion? Maybe it's better to accept it? Maybe it's time to finally admit that this path wasn't for me? I often thought it was time to stop. That was the thought that came to me more and more often. To recognize that I was not meant to be part of something bigger, that my efforts were not worthwhile. I was afraid that if I continued, I would lose even more. Lose not only time, but myself. I wasn't ready for this. I didn't want to be someone who finds strength only to lose it again. And that's where the real struggle began, not with the disease, but with myself. My head was saying one thing and my heart was saying another. I was starting to see results, and I couldn't figure out how to feel about it all. Every day I could feel the tension building. On one level, a certain incentive to fight, and on another, the desire to give up, to accept my defeat. It's scary when your feelings start to lead you to places where you can't really know what's going to happen next. And every day I gave in to that pressure. The world doesn't wait. You start listening to the opinions of the people whose faces you see around you, as if they're taking your side. All those suggestions that you need to relax, that not everything is in your hands, they sound like attempts to tell you that it's not worth fighting. Sometimes when I woke up in the morning, I noticed that I was getting more tired each day. It wasn't a physical fatigue. It was the fatigue of not being able to choose. And it was frightening. It was like there was no strength in the body, but at the same time there was some kind of internal overload. It was frightening to me. I started to notice the same symptoms starting to come back. I couldn't understand where it was all coming from. Something was missing, and something inside of me was starting to give out again. I was going back to the thoughts that once haunted me. Maybe I really shouldn't be struggling? Maybe I'm just not given this miracle? In that moment, I felt that familiar pain again. Not physical, but mental. The feeling that I'm on the brink. It wasn't just doubt. It was fear. Fear that I might lose this whole struggle despite the effort. Fear that I might realize the miracle wasn't mine, and no one would save me unless I believed in my own power. But how do you fight when your inner world starts throwing these thoughts at you? What if this is all just a waste of time that will lead me to disappointment? How do you keep going when you can't see the end? I began to give in to my fear. It was excruciating. The pain was returning, but now in a different form, not physical. It was the pain of doubt. At times, I began to think it might all be a joke in my head. Maybe there was no improvement. Maybe I was the one who had self-imposed the idea that I would survive? Or maybe I was just stuck on one idea and now I couldn't let it go. But here, on this edge, something else was beginning to emerge. I didn't know what to do, but one question kept bugging me. If I gave up, what would happen next? Would I live more peacefully knowing that I had done nothing, that I had not tried? And this is where I had to decide. Do I continue to give up, or do I go all the way, despite all my fears and doubts? That night, I realized that I could no longer just give up. Doubts continued to plague me, but even stronger was the certainty. If I didn't fight, who would? I thought I was done. I thought I was on the edge, that every step could be my last. But when you are really on the edge, when you feel that at any moment you could lose everything, you start to see things differently. the terror disappears, and with it goes the fear. And this amazing feeling of being free of fear was a turning point for me. I realized that the fear I had been living in was only my choice. I had allowed myself to be trapped in that cage. You see, we all live in a state of fear in one way or another. It lurks within each of us, the fear of losing, of not making it, of not becoming who you want to be. But as I stood there, exhausted, with a full feeling that there was nothing else left, I suddenly realized, I am the one who decides how I feel in this moment. I choose what comes next. No doctors, no diagnosis, no pain can make me give up unless I make that decision myself. I suddenly realized that my whole life, all these years of hoping everything would somehow work itself out, was an attempt to avoid fear, an attempt to escape reality. But reality was much simpler than I had imagined it to be. All I had to do was make a choice. To continue the fight without looking back at the doubts and fears. With each day, with each moment of doubt that I might not be able to cope, I realized more and more that I was not alone in this struggle. And then, out of the blue, I realized that I'm not just fighting for myself. I'm fighting for those around me. Those who continue to believe in me. For those who can't afford to give up because I am an example to them. Strangely, in that moment, it became clear to me. My whole life, even my illness, is all part of something bigger. I can't just give up because it's not just my journey, it's their journey too. When you realize that your actions affect those you love, suddenly there is incredible power. I couldn't just think about myself anymore. I had to think about those who expected more from me, who hoped for me. I began to realize the importance of my decision. It was not just a question of how I should live my life. It's a question of how do I exist for those around me. I can't be weak if there are people around me who need my courage. You know, in moments like this, when you feel that weight on your shoulders, but it gets lighter inside, you realize you need something more than just winning. You need to find meaning in what's happening to you. And suddenly I realized, this is not the end. It's the beginning of something new. I was always looking for meaning in life, trying to find some kind of answer. And now I realized that the point wasn't to be strong always. The point was to have the strength to not give up, even when it seems like everything is already lost. I stood in front of the mirror the day I made that choice and saw something new in myself. The pain I had ignored for so long wasn't gone, but it had become a part of me. It was no longer an enemy. It had become my teacher. And now I realized that my job was not to try to avoid the pain, but to use it to move forward. That's when I realized that if I was going to fight, I wasn't just going to fight for me. I'm going to fight for all those who can't afford to give up. For the sake of those who may someday witness this miracle, even if I can't call it a miracle. It was a moment of catharsis. The moment when this whole struggle was no longer just me. I suddenly felt everything around me change. And it wasn't magic. It was just a decision. I decided to move on. And when I made that decision, all the fears and doubts that had been plaguing me somehow disappeared. The fear of death, the fear of not having time, the fear of being weak, they all dissolved. And only one thought remained. If I don't give up, if I keep fighting, I will be a living example for others. And that thought gave me strength. I realized that there was nothing heroic in this decision, but this decision had everything. There was life in that decision. My life. And the lives of those who were waiting for me. I didn't know what to call it. It just kept on going. Improvements that I couldn't explain were happening day by day. At first it was small, almost imperceptible changes that I could easily write off as random or some physiological process that just takes time. But the more days went by, the clearer it became that it wasn't just recovery. First, I noticed that I could do things that seemed impossible to me before. Elementary things like climbing stairs without shortness of breath, breathing without chest pain, getting enough sleep without feeling like I was waking up every morning with a heaviness in my head and body. It's weird, inexplicable. And while I was grateful that I could experience this, there was some question lingering inside the whole time. Why is this happening? You know how it is when something good happens in life, but you still question it. You can't just go ahead and believe it. It's like someone keeps explaining to you that miracles don't happen, and suddenly you find yourself in the middle of something you can't call anything but a miracle. I can't say I was happy. Happiness doesn't really belong here. Rather, I felt anxious. Anxiety that in every moment of this improvement there was a mystery I could not fathom. The doctors, of course, could not understand what was happening to me. They watched my results, but their eyes grew more and more concerned. This was definitely not within the scope of their knowledge. The usual tests were showing one result, and I was starting to feel completely different. And then the strangest thing started to happen. I began to notice how the people around me started to treat me differently. I began to see admiration, amazement in the eyes of those who knew me before the disease. But not admiration that I had conquered the disease. There was something, a hunch in their gaze. They wouldn't tell me about it, but I realized they thought it was something more than just luck. And at some point I realized it was a miracle for them. But is it a miracle for me? I found my meaning. The recovery process was long, but not in the way I had envisioned. In fact, when your body gives you back your power, it's not a moment of victory. It's not a loud hurrah. It's a quiet and maybe the most meaningful victory that no one shouts about. I started walking the streets again, started working again, started meeting people again. Everything was coming back, but with one big difference. I was no longer the person I was before the illness. It was like a second breath, but not to just go back to my old life. It was like a rebirth, not a physical rebirth, but an inner rebirth. And that's where a strange thing started to happen. When I looked back on everything that had happened to me, I couldn't help but ask, why? But the more I tried to understand, the more one thing became clear. I couldn't go back to those old questions. My old view of life, of death, of miracles, of everything I had once considered important, suddenly became unimportant. All I knew for sure was that I was alive, and that was enough. I realized that a miracle doesn't need an explanation. It just is. And sometimes, despite your best efforts to find answers, you have to learn to let go. I didn't question it anymore. I accepted this moment as what it was, and that was the real gift. It didn't matter if it was a miracle, or if I was just able to find strength I didn't know I had. What mattered was that I was here, that I was experiencing, that I was able to see a new day. Many people tried to talk me into believing it was a miracle. But I didn't need that anymore. I didn't want to look for a reason and an explanation because that would destroy the peace of mind I had found. After all, at some point you realize that not everything in life needs to be explained. There are some things that exist simply because they exist. And that doesn't require proof. Saying goodbye to the past was not painful, but rather liberating. I was saying goodbye not to the disease itself, but to the fears and doubts that held me captive. I was saying goodbye to those moments of despair when I thought all was lost. I was saying goodbye to what once seemed real, but was now just a memory. And now, standing on this new frontier, I wasn't looking for the strength to fight. I no longer wanted to prove anything. I was just being, and that was far more important. I learned not to be afraid of death because I realized we're all going to be gone at some point. But what matters is how we live these moments that are given to us in life. And when you begin to realize this, you realize that the miracle is not something you have to look for. It's already there in you, in every moment of your life. I no longer wonder if it's a miracle. There is an inherent power in realizing that you are alive and not being afraid of it. I realized that all my previous experiences were not empty steps. It was a journey that led me to the most important thing, the ability to live and accept. And no matter what happened, what mattered was that I was willing to keep going. Looking back on it all now, I realize one thing. I am grateful. I am grateful for every day, for every moment I was given. And if it's a miracle, it didn't just happen to me. It happens to all of us when we begin to appreciate what we have. I can't say that I have all the answers, but I do know that I don't need to look for them. All I need to do is live, and to be grateful for every day. Sometimes in life we encounter moments that change us, but despite this, we can't fully understand exactly what happened. Could it have been a miracle? Or was it just a fluke that I experienced because I learned to believe that anything is possible? You know, I never found the answer to that question. And I probably won't. And maybe it doesn't matter. Miracle or chance are the questions that plague many of us when we encounter something incomprehensible and meaningful. We always seek to find an explanation, to find a cause, because it's easier that way. We need to organize everything so that it becomes logical and clear. But I've realized that sometimes the answers aren't important. What matters is that I'm alive. And that gives me a chance to change my life, a chance to start over. And it's that chance, that moment when you realize that your life is not yet complete, that gives you the strength to move forward. Life's inexplicable moments are not only miracles but also challenges. They make us think about death and life, about what we leave behind and what we may never be able to understand. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps our task is not to understand what happened to us, but to use this moment to change, to find the strength to move on, despite all the questions, despite all the doubts. Life is full of mysteries, and both death and life are full of questions with no clear answers. But maybe that's the point. We don't live not to solve all the riddles, but to use every moment, every breath, to create our own story. And maybe at the end of that story, when it's all over, we won't have an answer. And that will be quite enough. So maybe there was a miracle? Maybe it was just a fluke? I don't know. But one thing I do know is that I am alive. And it is my miracle that remains in every day, in every step forward.